When you are strong, you have 1,000 worries. But when you lose your strength, you have only one. Let me ask you this. What is the one thing we fear most as we get older? For many of us, it isn't the grey hair or the lines on our face. It's the loss of control. The moment a simple, everyday task becomes a monumental challenge. The moment a sudden fall can shatter not just a bone, but the very independence we cherish. Today, we're going to tell you the story of Margaret Thompson, a 72-year-old woman for whom this fear just became a terrifying reality. In our first chapters, we saw her struggling with her own body, unable to perform simple tasks. Then, we witnessed the fall, the one that left her helpless on her kitchen floor all night. Now, her daughter, out of love and fear, is already looking at assisted living homes. For Margaret, it feels like her world is closing in, that her life is no longer her own. This is the moment where everything changes, where the path seems to lead in only one direction. But what if it doesn't have to? What if this isn't the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter? In the story that follows, we will join Margaret as she takes one last, desperate step to save her independence. She's heading to a doctor's appointment that she believes will seal her fate, but she's about to receive a prescription unlike any she could have ever imagined, a series of simple, powerful ingredients she can add to her morning coffee. Stay with us, because her journey could change everything you think you know about aging and strength. If you, or someone you love, has ever worried about getting weaker with age, then this story is for you. Please take a moment to press the like button below. It truly helps our message of hope and health reach more people who need to hear it. And now, let us rejoin Margaret as she walks into the doctor's office and discover the first secret to rebuilding her life. The autumn wind carried the scent of salt and decay, a bittersweet perfume that clung to the damp air of Seabrook. It was a smell Margaret Thompson had known for 50 years, a scent that usually brought comfort. But this year, as the last of the crimson leaves surrendered to the grey sky, it felt less like a cozy blanket and more like a heavy shroud. From her kitchen window, she watched the gulls wheel and cry over the churning, slate-coloured sea. The world outside was a watercolour painting left in the rain, its edges bleeding into one another. Inside her small cottage, however, everything was in its place. Books were stacked neatly on polished wooden shelves, a testament to her life as a librarian. Framed photographs of her late husband, Robert, his smile as warm and constant as the old grandfather clock in the hall, watched over the quiet rooms. This house was more than wood and nails. It was an archive of her life, a sanctuary of memory, and lately she had begun to feel like its ghost. Her gaze fell upon the 20-pound bag of organic potting soil sitting by the back door. It had been there for 3 days, a squat, brown monument to her own inadequacy. All it needed was to be carried the 20 feet to the garden shed. A simple task, a task she had performed 1,000 times. Taking a deep, preparatory breath, Margaret wrapped her arms around the bag. She bent her knees, just as Robert had always told her to. Lift with your legs, Margie, not your back. His voice was a phantom whisper in the silent kitchen. She strained, her muscles screaming in protest. The bag lifted an inch off the floor, then 2. A tremor started in her thighs, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that traveled up her spine. Black spots danced in her vision, and the cheerful ticking of the clock seemed to grow faint, as if receding down a long tunnel. She dropped the bag with a soft thud. It landed accusingly on the linoleum floor. Leaning against the counter, Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the wave of dizziness to pass, and for the frantic drumming in her chest to slow to a manageable rhythm. It wasn't just weakness, it was a betrayal. Her own body, the vessel that had carried her through 72 years of life, was now a stranger, an unreliable and rebellious tenant. This was her secret, the one she guarded more fiercely than the fragile first editions on her shelves, the daily inventory of small defeats. The way she now planned her trips upstairs, gathering everything she might need for hours to avoid a second climb. The way her hand would instinctively reach for a wall, a doorknob, the back of a chair, seeking an anchor in a world that had begun to tilt and sway. Her weekly walks with Clara and Eleanor, old friends from the library, had dwindled to polite, rain-checked excuses whispered over the phone. How could she explain that the gentle slope down to the harbor now felt like a treacherous mountain descent? The shame of it was a leaden weight in her stomach. Later that afternoon, a sliver of watery sunlight broke through the clouds. Seizing the moment, Margaret decided to dust the high shelves in the living room, a task that required the small two-step stool. She reached for a collection of poetry, her fingers just brushing the leather spine, when a sudden instability seized her. The stool wobbled. For a terrifying second, she was suspended in air, her arms flailing, the world a blur of color and motion. She landed hard against the bookshelf, her shoulder absorbing the impact with a sharp, searing pain. Books rained down around her. She stood there, gasping for breath, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was the closeness of it, the sickening lurch of gravity taking hold, that truly frightened her. One day, she knew she wouldn't be so lucky. One day, the floor would not be a near miss. It would be a destination. The ringing of the telephone was a shrill intrusion into the heavy silence. She knew who it was before she even saw the caller ID. Sarah. "Hi, Mom." Just calling to check in, her daughter's voice was bright, but beneath it, Margaret could hear the familiar hum of anxiety. It was the tone of an investigator pretending to be a friend. "How are things? Are you eating properly?" "Of course, dear. I'm fine," Margaret said, her voice a little too tight, a little too quick. She began gathering the fallen books, trying to sound casual, just doing a bit of tidying. "You sound out of breath," Sarah noted immediately, her perception as sharp as a doctor's scalpel. "Are you sure you're not overdoing it? You know you need to take it easy." "I am taking it easy," Margaret replied, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Seabrook is the definition of easy, Sarah." There was a pause, the kind that preceded a difficult topic. "I was just reading about that lovely new assisted living community that opened up over in Pine Ridge," Sarah began, her words chosen with deliberate care. "The Willows, it's called. They have beautiful garden apartments, social activities, chef-prepared meals, and, medical staff right there on site, just in case." Margaret's knuckles turned white as she gripped the phone. The room felt suddenly cold. The Willows. It sounded like a prison dressed in floral wallpaper. The words were couched in love, she knew, but the meaning was clear. You are no longer capable. You are a problem to be managed. Your life, as you know it, is over. "I don't need a chef-prepared meal, Sarah," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I have my own kitchen. I have my own garden." "I know, Mom. But I'm not having this conversation," Margaret cut in, the old, firm librarian's tone returning. "Everything is perfectly fine." She ended the call a few moments later, the polite goodbyes a thin veil over the chasm of misunderstanding that had opened between them. Staring out the window, Margaret watched as the brief, hopeful sunlight was swallowed once more by a bank of dark, bruised-looking clouds rolling in from the sea. The storm was coming, and she had no idea how she would weather it alone. The night the world tilted on its axis, a fierce autumn rain hammered against the cottage. Margaret had just finished a simple bowl of soup when she pushed herself up from the kitchen table. It happened without warning. A violent wave of dizziness stole the floor from beneath her feet, and the room dissolved into a nauseating swirl. She fell not with a stumble, but with a dead weight, a jarring thud that knocked the air and the fight from her lungs. Panic gave way to a chilling helplessness as she lay on the cold linoleum, her muscles refusing to obey. The familiar kitchen became a prison, and the hours stretched into a dark, lonely eternity. It was her neighbor, Mr. Henderson, who found her the next morning, pale and weak. His concerned call brought Sarah in a whirlwind of fear and fury. The sight of her bruised mother turned Sarah's love into a sharp-edged ultimatum. "That's it," Sarah declared, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and terror. "I knew this would happen. You cannot live here alone anymore." The argument was swift and brutal. Margaret's pleas for her independence sounded like whispers against the storm of her daughter's terror. To buy herself precious time, Margaret offered a final, desperate bargain. "Let me see the new doctor in town," she pleaded. "Whatever she says, I promise, I'll do it." Sarah, seeing this as a clear path to proving her point, reluctantly agreed. "Fine," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of her decision. "You'll see the doctor, but Mom, this is your last chance." Margaret walked into the town's medical clinic with the grim resignation of a soldier heading into a trial. She expected sterile white walls, the faint smell of antiseptic, and a doctor who would look at her chart more than her face. She was prepared for a clinical verdict that would serve as the ammunition for Sarah's well-intentioned siege. The office of Dr. Evelyn Reed was nothing like she'd imagined. The walls were painted a soft, calming sage green. A healthy-looking fiddle leaf fig stood in the corner, and the air smelled faintly of lavender. Dr. Reed herself was a woman in her late 30s, with kind, intelligent eyes and a smile that reached them. She didn't start with a clipboard, she started with a question. "Margaret," she said, her voice warm, "tell me what's been going on, and tell me how you feel about it." The unexpected dam of empathy broke. Margaret found herself pouring out the story not just of her fall, but of the creeping fear, the humiliating weakness, and the terrifying prospect of losing her home. Dr. Reed listened without interruption, her focus absolute. When Margaret finished, her voice thick with unshed tears, the doctor simply nodded. "What you're experiencing is incredibly common," Dr. Reed began gently. "It has a name: sarcopenia. It's the natural, age-related loss of muscle mass. It's not a personal failure, Margaret. It's a physiological process. But that doesn't mean we are helpless against it. In fact, our first line of defense isn't in the pharmacy, it's in the kitchen." She pulled a notepad closer, not a prescription pad. "You mentioned your stomach has been sensitive to dairy milk lately. That's also common, but your muscles are crying out for two things to function properly: calcium and magnesium. Calcium helps them contract, to lift your arm or take a step. Magnesium helps them relax afterward. Without a balance of both, they become weak and inefficient." Margaret listened, intrigued despite her skepticism. "So," Dr. Reed continued, writing on the pad, "the first prescription I am giving you is for your morning coffee." She turned the pad around. On it, she had written in neat script, "Unsweetened almond milk. Just 1 cup has nearly half the calcium you need for an entire day, plus a good dose of magnesium. It's gentle on your stomach, and it will give your muscles the basic tools they need to start working properly again." Margaret stared at the simple words. It seemed too easy, too mundane, to combat the monster that had brought her to her knees. But as she left the clinic, clutching the note in her hand, she felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in months. It was not the heavy weight of despair, but the fragile, fluttering lightness of a possibility. It wasn't a medical order to be followed, but a choice she could make. On the way home, she stopped at the market and bought her first carton of almond milk. For 2 weeks, Margaret followed her new ritual. She replaced the dairy in her morning coffee with the almond milk. The taste was pleasant, nutty, and light, and she had to admit the persistent, low-grade digestive discomfort she had grown used to began to fade. The changes were subtle: a little less stiffness in the morning, a fraction more energy in the afternoon, but the psychological shift was immense. She was no longer a passive victim of aging. She was an active participant in her own recovery. At her follow-up appointment, Dr. Reed smiled, pleased with the report. "Excellent. We've laid the foundation. Now, let's talk about fuel. Your muscles run on glucose, but as we get older, our cells can become resistant to insulin, the hormone that helps deliver that glucose. The sugar ends up staying in your bloodstream instead of powering your muscles, which can make them even weaker." She opened a drawer in her desk and took out a small jar of a fragrant, reddish-brown powder. "The next ingredient for your coffee is one of the oldest spices in the world: cinnamon powder." Dr. Reed explained how cinnamon gently helps improve the body's sensitivity to insulin, allowing glucose to enter the muscle cells more easily. "Think of it as a key that helps unlock the door to your muscles so the fuel can get in," she said. "Just half a teaspoon in your morning coffee." Bolstered by this new knowledge, Margaret felt a fresh wave of determination. The following week, a rare, pale gold afternoon broke through the autumn gloom. On impulse, Margaret put on her coat and her sturdiest walking shoes. She walked out her front door, down the short path, and turned onto the street. She kept her head up, her pace slow but steady. She walked all the way to the old oak tree at the end of the block and back again. She wasn't breathless. Her legs didn't tremble. As she stood on her porch, watching the winter waves crash against the distant seawall, she felt a surge of triumph. It was the first battle she had truly won. Just as Margaret began to feel a rhythm of progress, the Seabrook winter arrived in earnest. It came with a damp, penetrating cold that settled deep in her bones. With it, her arthritis, a long dormant dragon, awoke with a fiery roar. The joints in her knees and hands throbbed with a dull, constant ache that made every movement an exercise in willpower. The simple act of opening a jar or climbing the stairs became a painful ordeal, and the desire to simply sit still, wrapped in a blanket, threatened to undo all her hard work. She confessed her frustration to Dr. Reed, her voice heavy with despondency. "I feel like I've taken one step forward and 2 steps back. My muscles might be getting the right fuel, but the engine is too rusty to move." Dr. Reed nodded with a deep, knowing empathy. "The body is a connected system, Margaret. We can't fix one part while ignoring another. Inflammation is the rust, so we need to address it. And we also need to make sure your body can actually use the protein you're eating to rebuild the muscle." She reached for another small jar. This one contained a pale yellow powder with a sharp, clean scent. "Ginger powder," she announced. "1 teaspoon in your coffee. Ginger is a powerful, natural anti-inflammatory. It will help calm that fire in your joints. But it also does something else remarkable. It contains something called gingerol, which gently stimulates your digestion, helping your body produce the enzymes it needs to break down protein and send it directly to your muscles." The effect of the ginger was more profound than Margaret could have imagined. Within a week, a gentle, persistent warmth seemed to spread through her, soothing the ache in her knees. Her digestion, which had always felt sluggish in the cold, became calm and efficient. She found herself eating with a healthier appetite, enjoying the protein-rich fish and eggs Dr. Reed had recommended without any discomfort. One afternoon, she called Clara and Eleanor. "I was thinking of going for tea at the Salty Dog Cafe," she said, her voice steady. "Would you care to join me?" Sitting in the warm, bustling cafe, surrounded by the chatter of friends and the aroma of baking, Margaret felt like she was rejoining the world. Her friends noticed it too. "There's a light back in your eyes, Margie," Eleanor said, patting her hand. "It's good to see it again." Margaret had turned a corner. The joint pain was manageable, her energy was more consistent, and her spirits were high. Dr. Reed had given her a simple routine of resistance exercises she could do at home. Squats while holding onto a chair, lifting small cans of soup like weights, wall push-ups. She had the knowledge and the will, but she still lacked the physical spark. After 5 or 6 repetitions, a deep cellular fatigue would set in, and her muscles would simply refuse to continue. She had built a better engine, but she was still running on low-grade fuel. "We've opened the doors to your muscles with cinnamon and helped rebuild the parts with ginger," Dr. Reed explained during their next meeting. "Now we need to give them a high-octane, premium fuel source that they can use instantly." This time, she presented Margaret with a bottle of clear, liquid oil. "Medium-chain triglyceride oil," she said, or MCT oil for short. Unlike other fats, these are processed directly by your liver and converted into something called ketones. Ketones are an immediate source of energy for both your brain and your muscles. It's like a direct power line, bypassing the slower, more complicated energy grid. The MCT oil was a revelation. Margaret started with just 1 teaspoon in her coffee, as instructed. The persistent afternoon slump that had plagued her for years vanished. When she attempted her exercises, it was as if a new power source had been switched on. She completed 10 chair squats, then 12. She felt the burn of effort, but not the crushing wall of fatigue. She felt a returning sense of power in her limbs, a strength she thought was lost to memory. That weekend, Sarah came to visit. She arrived with her usual armor of concern, her purse full of brochures for assisted living communities, prepared for another gentle but firm battle of wills. She found her mother, not in an armchair, but in the garden, on her knees, energetically turning the soil in a dormant flower bed. Sarah stopped in the driveway, stunned into silence. She watched as Margaret, holding a trowel, pushed herself up from a kneeling position to standing, smoothly, gracefully, without reaching for anything to support her. The tension that had been the backdrop of their every conversation for months seemed to dissolve into the crisp winter air. For the first time, Sarah's question wasn't an accusation. It was a soft, wondering whisper. "Mom," she said, walking slowly across the lawn. "What have you been doing? You look strong." The thaw in Sarah's demeanor was as welcome as the first signs of spring. Margaret's confidence soared, and she began to feel like herself again, the capable, independent woman who could manage her own life and her own home. Yet, a shadow of fear remained. It was a physical memory of the fall, a ghost that whispered doubts. Her legs, while stronger, often felt cold, a reminder of poor circulation that she worried could lead to another dizzy spell. This was the last barrier, the final ghost she needed to exorcise. At their next meeting, which now felt less like a doctor's appointment and more like a chat between partners, Dr. Reed smiled. "You've rebuilt the engine and given it the best fuel. Now, let's make sure the fuel lines are wide open. I have one last thing for your coffee," she said, a playful twinkle in her eye. "This one might surprise you." She presented a small shaker filled with a brilliant red powder, cayenne pepper. Capsaicin, the compound that makes peppers hot, is wonderful for circulation, Dr. Reed explained. It helps relax and strengthen your blood vessels, pushing warm, oxygen-rich blood to the very ends of your limbs. It gets the energy right where you need it most. Margaret was cautious, starting with just the tiniest pinch in her morning brew. It added a surprising, pleasant warmth that seemed to spread from the inside out, a gentle, internal fire. Over the next week, she noticed that the persistent chill in her feet and hands began to recede. That Saturday, the sun was bright in a clear, cold sky. Margaret walked to her back door and looked at the bag of potting soil. It was still there, a silent testament to the woman she had been just a few months ago. It was her ultimate test. She took a deep breath, bent her knees, and wrapped her arms around the bag. She lifted. It was heavy, but it was a good weight, a satisfying weight. Her legs were steady, solid pillars beneath her. There was no tremor, no dizziness. With a steady, determined pace, she carried the bag out the door and across the yard to the garden shed. She didn't stop there. She opened the bag, filled her wheelbarrow, and spent the entire afternoon preparing a new flower bed, turning the rich, dark earth, her body moving with a forgotten rhythm. The physical work was tiring, but it was an exhilarating, cleansing exhaustion. Each spadeful of dirt was a declaration of victory over the fear that had held her captive for so long. Months passed. The stubborn chill of winter finally relented, giving way to the tender green shoots and soft, hopeful air of a Seabrook spring. Margaret's garden, once a source of anxiety, was now a riot of vibrant color. The yellow daffodils and deep purple crocuses she had planted with her own steady hands pushed through the dark soil, tilting their faces to the Sunday. She was a woman transformed. The hesitant shuffle had been replaced by a confident stride. The fear in her eyes had been supplanted by a calm, clear-eyed serenity. She had not turned back the clock, but she had learned how to wind it again, to appreciate its steady, precious tick. One bright April morning, we see her walking along the coastal path, the salty wind tugging playfully at her scarf. Clara and Eleanor are at her side, their chatter and laughter mixing with the cry of the gulls as they easily keep pace with her. Sarah is visiting for the weekend. Her car is in the driveway, but there are no brochures on the passenger seat. She isn't here to check up on her mother. She is here to help her plant a row of rose bushes, their hands working together in the dirt, their relationship rebuilt on a new foundation of mutual respect and admiration. The story ends as it began, with Margaret in her kitchen. The morning sun streams through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She sits at her small table, cradling her favorite mug. She takes a slow, mindful sip of her morning coffee, a fragrant custom blend of almond milk, cinnamon, ginger, MCT oil, and a tiny, fiery pinch of cayenne. She looks at her steady hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, then out the window at her blooming, vibrant garden. A deep sense of peace settles over her. She has not defeated age, but she has embraced it, nourished it, and in doing so, has cultivated a second, beautiful spring for herself. Thank you for joining us on Margaret's journey. Her story is a reminder that it's never too late to take control of your health, and that sometimes the most profound solutions can be found in the simplest of places. We hope her story has inspired you. If you'd like to discover more stories of hope and learn about other simple, natural ways to support your well-being, please consider subscribing. We look forward to seeing you again in our next video.